Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, we will be exploring the life of Henrietta Maria, the wife of Charles I. We will be discussing Henrietta with Leanda de Lisle. Leanda de Lisle is a best-selling historian and journalist, acclaimed for her work on the Tudor and Stuart dynasties. A history graduate of Somerville College, Oxford, she began her career in national newspapers before turning to historical writing. Her debut, after Elizabeth, was runner-up for the Saltire Society's first book of the year and inspired several novels, and her New York Times bestseller, The Sisters Who Would Be Queen, was praised as gripping and unrivaled. Her Tudor, The Family Story, became a Sunday Times bestseller, while White King, a biography of Charles I, featuring newly discovered royal letters, won the Historical Writers Association non-fiction crown. Her latest book, a biography of Queen Henrietta Maria, was shortlisted for the Elizabeth Longford Prize. Leanda regularly contributes to TV, radio, and publications, including The Times, BBC History Magazine, and The Spectator. She is currently working on a book about Thomas Wolsey. Welcome to the podcast, Leanda. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
So today we're discussing Queen Henrietta Maria. But before we get on to her, I thought we could ask a little bit about yourself. I thought, when did you first become interested in history?
I think as a really quite young child, actually, I was a sort of quite as a bookish brat, and I used to read a lot of historical fiction. I quite like kind of sort of slightly boys' own stories, Henry Treece, things like that. As I got older, I would read some more girly ones, Georgia Hare. But anyway, so I read a lot of historical fiction. I enjoyed film, of course. When we're thinking of the Tudors, we might think of, Anne of 1,000 Days or A Man for All Seasons. And then when I was a grown-up, I enjoyed actually watching with my children. Do you remember that series, The Tudors?
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people are drawn into history initially by fiction. And then I started reading, factual history. I very much enjoyed it at school. And indeed, I studied history at university. I went to Oxford, Somerville College, Oxford, and read history there, which is great.
How did you pursue a career in history?
Well, it wasn't something I initially considered doing. But I was always a writer, and I went into journalism at first, and so I worked as a journalist for, I don't know, forever it seemed, doing all sorts of different things. I mean, I did, and for all sorts of very different people. So I did sort of funny columns and serious columns, opinion columns and features. I started on the sort of Hackney Gazette, and then I sort of graduated onto, for the Nationals. I wrote for the Guardian newspaper, for the Spectator magazine. So, left wing, right wing, whatever. And so I did that. And the thing is, if you're a columnist, they say you need to be an angry person, so I was definitely one of those people who would pick up the newspapers and feel sort of furious about whatever it was I read. And then one day I woke up and I found that I was looking at pictures of sort of cute animals and hippos and dogs and things like that, and I thought, really, I need to start doing something else. This isn't a columnist is not someone who actually looks at the newspaper and only wants to read about nice dog stories and things. So, so I thought I'm going to go back. And somebody suggested I went back to my first love, which was history, and so I did. So I did an outline on the death of Elizabeth and the coming of the Stuarts. Because I think most people had assumed at that time, which was like 20 years ago now, most people had assumed that James the First of Scots, James Stuart, was Elizabeth Tudor's heir. And so she died and he became king, and that was that. Whereas in fact, it was much more complicated than that. And James was actually not her heir under the last act of succession. And so it was a dramatic story. And I became very interested in the Tudor succession at that point.
What about Henrietta Maria made you want to write a book about her?
Well, I did a book on Charles I. I'd very much enjoyed, again, as a teenager, C.V. Wedgwood's books or The King's Peace, The King's War, The King's Trial on Charles I. And I've always been, and Stuarts for some reason have fallen out of fashion. But it's a fantastic story. And so I wrote a biography of Charles called White King. And I thought he was worth rehabilitating to some extent, because I think one of the reasons I think people don't realize how interesting it is that Charles has been perceived as such a sort of weak and tiresome person that no one wants to read about him, which was just quite wrong and very unfortunate. But it has to be said that when I was writing the book, the person who I thought had been really done badly and is a completely amazing human being is Henrietta Maria. And so I wrote the book, and I said to my agent, I really, really want to do a book on Henrietta Maria. And she said, "Oh, no, no, people just think it's the boring bits you've left out from my lost book." So I said to her, I swear there's not a single moment in which this woman breathes, which is in any way boring. And there's a lot to say, and people will love it when they actually read it and read the story. And so that's why I did it. So I took a bit of a gamble there.
I mean, I think it worked because it is a fantastic book, and it from the public myth of, she contributed to the Civil War. When you actually read the book, you're like, this woman's fascinating, and why are we dismissing her so easily?
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
So on to Henrietta. Who were Henrietta's parents, and what family was she born into?
Well, she was a princess of France. Her mother was also an amazing character, Marie de Medici, Italian. Fantastic woman, much hated, who became, when her husband died, her husband, Henri IV, Henry the Great in French myth, was a great king of France. He won the crown of France really on the sort of battlefield, a very popular king. I have to say that I did not warm to him myself. He was a bit of a perv, to be honest. At the end of his life, he was sort of chasing around after sort of 14-year-old girls. Well, I won't even go to some of the kind of pervy stuff he got up to. Actually, that's something that's just, anyway, not good. Let's put it like that. Whereas Marie de Medici, who is sort of not much admired in history, was an extraordinary woman who essentially her husband was assassinated when Henrietta Maria was just a baby, and Marie de Medici became regent of France and ruled France, which was an incredibly sort of misogynistic country, and was rather fabulous and amazing, to be honest. And so her story is a part of this story, actually, and I think people will enjoy reading about her as well. So yeah, so two very strong characters, her parents. Her father, very much a warrior king. Henrietta would very much be a warrior queen.
What sort of education did Henrietta receive? Did she receive a very high education at the time?
No, it was a slightly crap education, to be honest. Interestingly, in the 16th century, under the Tudors, you see this sort of interest in educating aristocratic and royal women. So Elizabeth I, for example, was highly educated. Mary Tudor, Mary I was highly educated. Lady Jane Grey queen for 9 or 13 days, depending on where you look at it, also highly educated. But this had gone out of fashion really in the 17th century. Suddenly, women weren't being properly educated. And to be honest, this has been true of the most of English history, right up until I was about 17 or 18. When I was at school 1,000 years ago, you had state grammar schools for girls, so there were a lot of girls who were highly educated in the grammar, who were the ones who were fortunate enough to get into a grammar school at any rate. Whereas if you were educated, as a private school, as I was, you were sort of basically being taught how to sort of knit booties, and that was about it, frankly. The parents weren't that interested in educating their daughters. It's incredibly frustrating. Luckily, the nuns who taught me were themselves actually rather keen on female education, so I was sort of saved by that. But anyway, well, putting that on one side. So Henrietta Maria, she wasn't particularly well educated. She was educated, certainly not academically, let's put it like that. She was educated, interestingly, in things like how to perform on a public stage, which was important not simply as a matter of court entertainment, but of course, if you were a royal person, you were on a public stage all the time through your life. So she did not know about that and understand about that. She didn't speak Latin, for example, or know Latin. And there's a hilarious description of when she's Queen of England and some ambassador comes and gives an interminably long speech in Latin. He's going on and on and on and on and on and on. And she's standing there. Of course, she doesn't understand a word. And she gets the most terrible giggles. And then all her sort of ladies also sort of end up collapsing in giggles. They're sort of standing there trying to look po-faced, listening to this, unintelligible speech. But anyway, so yeah, not a brilliant education.
Was Henrietta close with her family? Was she at a certain residence when she lived in France? Sorry.
She was, which was not untypical. She wasn't sort of being looked after by mummy, really. That just didn't happen. She was put in her own palace with the other sort of young children, and they were brought up by a governess. But sort of mummy came and visited, and mummy, as in Marie de Medici, did suddenly take a very close interest in her children, how they were getting on. They had a good religious education, I suppose. She wasn't completely uneducated, but she had a good religious education, so they checked on that, how she was doing in her how her health was, kept an eye on them like that. So yes, Marie de Medici was not a bad mother. She was quite a good mother, actually. Unfortunate quarrels with her son, but that's another matter.
When did Henrietta first meet Charles?
So the first time she didn't actually meet him, so I should see him. So Charles had decided he was going to marry the Infanta of Spain and was going to woo her himself. And so he sneaked out of England with the then Marquis, soon to be Duke of Buckingham. And they arrived at the French court in disguise, literally wearing false beards. They went to a shop in Paris and bought some stick-on beard, and then they turned up at the Louvre or whatever with the palace and with their stick-on beards, and they went to see a sort of ballet in which Henrietta Maria was performing. And so he certainly saw her then, and she may have seen him. But then he went off to Spain. 2 years later, that was 1623. 2 years later, 1625. They were married. There was a marriage alliance, an Anglo-French marriage alliance. And so she saw him for the first time, age 15, as a young bride when she arrived in England, feeling rather seasick, poor girl.
I can imagine 15 is so young, isn't it, to be getting married?
Very, and she was very much a teenager, quite stroppy, quite passionate. Yeah.
When Henrietta arrived in England, do we know about her reaction to meeting Charles for the first time?
Well, she'd been told by her mother that, she must be a sort of good wife and she must obey him and all the rest of it, and try and encourage a friendship between England and France. The only thing her mother said is that she must also remain faithful to her religion, her Catholic religion. So When Henrietta Maria meets Charles, she flings herself on her knees and she says, I hope, I'll be a good wife to you. Um, Charles is immediately checking her out and notices when he raises her up that she's not much smaller than he is, and he's been told that she's small for her age. And she notices it immediately because she's the kind of person who notices everything. And so she says immediately, yes, I'm not wearing high heels. This is just how tall I am. Um, and yeah, she shows her character, you might say, immediately. She's as sharp as a tack.
When Henrietta obviously marries Charles, was she a popular choice? Because obviously her religion was not liked in England.
Well, I think that was a problem. There was a lot of prejudice against her as a Catholic. And poor girl. So she arrives because there's been this Anglo-French alliance, but the alliance is breaking down even before she arrives in England. And so it's very unfortunate timing. Charles has promised that she will be able to practice her religion freely, but you know he breaks a lot of his promises. The chapels, there aren't chapels for her, and he's promised to stop persecuting English Catholics for their faith, and he doesn't. On the contrary, they become more persecuted, and she gets very, very angry. And there's one. I think she gets very she gets very angry with him. And there's one actually quite hilarious scene with which he describes to the Duke of Buckingham, which he says they were sitting there in bed, and I say to her, look, you can't appoint, Mr. Bloggs from France to run your estates because, I only want English people running your estates, your landed estates that are going to give you money in England. And then she completely loses her temper and says, I was supposed to do this, and I should be allowed to do this, and my life is miserable, it's all horrible, and it's all your fault. It's particularly this line, it's all your fault, which is such a wonderful sort of teenage, it's your fault. And Charles is completely astonished by this, he's a king. He can't believe that his wife is talking to him like this. But anyway, she does. And so the early years of their life, of their marriage, were quite tricky.
Were the early years of their marriage difficult because of the promises he made to France about not persecuting English Catholics, and because Henrietta primarily wanted French Catholics in her household?
Um, I think it was. I think the problem was the breakdown in relations between the two countries, the problems over religion, and both sides being encouraged by by others who it wasn't so much the couple themselves, it was those around them who were making life more difficult for them. Charles was stubborn. They're both quite stubborn. So I think that was a problem. The business of her French household. Again, you've got this young girl who's 15. When she turns 16, her household is all sent back, are all packed off back to France, and not in a very nice way either. Charles sort of, sends them off after a sort of flaming row. They're literally just kind of packed off overnight. And these include people who've looked after her since she was a baby, bearing in mind that her mother was a relatively distant figure. So these are like her family, and she's a very young girl. So she is extremely distressed about that. It says, indeed, she writes home saying, I'm going to die, do something about it. I'm going to die. I can't stand it. But to be fair on Charles, it was quite normal to send back, the ladies who arrive with you. I mean, you'd keep some, and to be replaced by English, and it was quite right that they were, and it was actually much better for her that happened. Quite apart from anything else, it meant she had to learn English. So yeah, but she was upset about it. And again, as I say, but you have to remember she was a very young girl. Of course, she was upset. Anybody would be.
Was another big thing that was troubling the early days of their marriage, well, the outside factions, was where Henrietta was to pray. She wanted a private chapel.
Well, that was a part of the marriage treaty that she was allowed to have a private chapel. So yes, it was. So if she wasn't given what was a part of the marriage treaty, that was obviously upsetting for her, and it was a threat. That her co-religionists were being persecuted um, to death, literally. So she was naturally fearful what might happen to her.
Mm. When Henrietta started to settle more into her role as queen, what was she like as a queen? Was she very active in politics? Was she a patron of the arts?
She wasn't particularly active in English politics at first. She became so, but not in the early years. She was active actually in French politics. She quarreled with Cardinal Richelieu in France on behalf of her mother. Um, but in England, she was certainly a great patron of the arts, particularly the theatre. She introduced, I mean, the English were shocked and horrified by to see women talking on stage. They were absolutely appalled by this. And during the, under Oliver Cromwell, that all came to a stop. But yes, so she uh, also, Charles was a great patron of art, of pictures, but actually he collected old masters, whereas she liked modern art and bought a lot of modern art. Her mother was a great patron of the arts, and came from Florence. So yes, so Henrietta Maria was a great patron of the arts. She did become involved in politics as time passed. Interestingly, bearing in mind that one of the myths is that she was some kind of terrible Catholic bigot, for which you can just read she was a Catholic, not a bigot. She her friends at court were the Puritan faction, i.e., the more extreme Protestant faction. Now, they were relatively moderate compared to those outside the court, because they were courtiers. But actually, many of her closest friends were from the Puritan faction, and this was in part due to international politics. The Puritan faction were anti-Spanish, uh, and more pro-French, and Henrietta Maria was more pro-French and anti-Spanish, so they had that in common. And the Puritan faction, people in the Puritan faction at court they weren't sort of wandering around dressed in black, only eating turnips and insisting on having a miserable time. These were people who were good company, and Henrietta Maria really liked men, and she liked men who were fun. She liked women too, but she liked people who were fun, who were good company. She was clever. She liked people who were witty and enjoyed themselves. She was full of joie de vivre, as the French would say.
When Henrietta had children of her own, did she try to influence their religious upbringing?
Well, she was told that she could bring them up as Catholic until they were, I can't remember, 9 or something. But this didn't happen. They were brought up as Protestant from the beginning, which actually she accepted. And things changed later on. I mean, one of the things I think one has to remember is that what sometimes happens in history, which is incredibly annoying and very stupid, is people will look at somebody's whole life, and then they will look at things that happened late in life and then apply that as if it was true, always true. Where actually, the person you are now may not be the same person you were 20 years ago or in 20 years' time, or you may not be believing the same thing or doing the same things. That's just a fact. And so one needs to look at the different stages of her life. So if we're talking about the 1620s, 30s, talking about 1630s, then particularly the early half of the 1630s, really before things started getting near the Civil War, then no, she wasn't influencing. I mean, I'm sure she wanted them to be Catholic, but she accepted that they weren't.
What was Henrietta's role during the breakout of the English Civil War?
Well, I think, it began to dawn on Henrietta Maria that, her husband was pretty useless at politics. And so she had to kind of step in to try and stop sort of total disaster. So actually, one of the things she did is that, as I said, Charles was very stubborn, and she did try and persuade him to be more flexible, to bend rather than break. But he wouldn't. And so that failed. And the Civil War began. And things had got very, very nasty, very, very nasty indeed. It's like the French Revolution, and indeed her life seemed to be threatened. Uh, but so Civil War was about to break out, and she went to Europe um, to raise money and men and arms for her husband, who had none, because there was no standing army in England. And at this point, Parliament had full control of really London, the money, what men there were, soon enough, what munitions there were. And it was assumed that when Civil War broke out, that Charles would be defeated in the first battle, and it would all be over by Christmas, as people always say when there's war coming. It'll all be over by Christmas. But she was hugely successful at raising both money and arms, which she shipped back to England. And as a result, Charles survived the first great battle of the Civil War at Edge Hill.
Henrietta is often accused of influencing her husband and his decision during this period. How true is this?
Well, unfortunately for Charles, not nearly true enough. If he'd listened to her a bit more, he might have done a lot better. No, he frequently ignored her advice, which was very unfortunate. Indeed, during the Civil War, um, there were examples of military decisions he made that proved disastrous. For example, at one point, there's an opportunity arises for him to retake London, which she suggests he does, and he refuses to do so. And the Scots are on the point of joining the Civil War. And she knows that when that happens, there's going to be a sort of tipping point, and the numbers are going to be against Charles. And he ignores her. And the Scots do then indeed join, do then indeed ally with with Parliament against the king, and it's really then just a matter of time before he's defeated.
Did Henrietta, for the majority of the Civil War, stay in Europe?
She came back in the February after Edge Hill, which, as I said, was in October, and she spent a year, I think, something like that, in England, and was again tremendously successful. She was in the north for a lot of that time, and then she was in Oxford. She joined Charles in Oxford and played her part, I said, in the Civil War, and certainly in the military campaigns in the north. And when she came south to see Charles, I mean, her army, fought on the way south. So yes, but then she went to France, again because Charles needed somebody there to raise money and buy military equipment.
When the Civil War was happening, was Henrietta a bit of a scapegoat for what was going wrong in the country?
Oh yes, very much so. And they called her the sort of generalissimo again because there's the whole idea of her wearing the trousers, of things being turned upside down, a woman in a man's role, and so forth. And yes, again because she was a Catholic, and it sort of looked back to Eve, the Adam and Eve, Adam, you have this, a slightly gormless figure of Adam in the Bible. And then Eve is tempted by Satan and, eats the apple of knowledge and then gives it to her gormless Adam, who, does as she says and, eats from the forbidden fruit. And that brings evil into the world. So it's all sort of Eve's fault, basically. And so you have that element being played out again, that she is Eve seducing Charles into evil.
When things started to look like Charles may possibly be executed in the latter half, well, the last year of 1649, do we know if Henrietta tried to do anything to stop this outcome?
Yes, she did. She wrote letters, and asked if she could come back to England to at least see him. Of course, the French ambassador and things was supposed to try and persuade um, Cromwell and the others not to chop off Charles's head. And she was very, very shocked when it happened. And there's a sort of terrible scene of her being brought the news when she's sitting eating her meal in the Louvre. And she's so stunned. She just sits there like a statue in shock while sort of darkness is falling until eventually someone leads her by the hand to her bedchamber. It's a very tragic scene.
What was the aftermath for Henrietta and the royalists? What did Henrietta try to do during the 10 years before her son ascended the throne?
She fought on. She fought on for her son, Charles II, did everything she could possible to support him. Again, raising money, helping, trying to help them to survive, putting pressure on the French to support her son, suggesting marriage alliances. She did everything she possibly could, really. I think she was dying to retire and live quietly. She often wasn't terribly well, but she continued to be a very remarkable woman, and she didn't give up.
Did Henrietta return to England upon the accession of her eldest son, Charles II?
Yes, indeed, she did. And she came to London quite quietly at first. Um, and I think it was a time of joy mixed with terrible, terrible sadness and tragedy because she lost two of her children that same in that same autumn. And so she was naturally devastated by that. And there's a famous description of her written by the diarist Samuel Pepys, in which she's described as, looking just like a sort of little tiny person dressed in black and looking like nothing at all. And usually this is how biographers leave her, as this sort of rather tragic figure, which again is actually fantastically annoying. And I quote the same man, Samuel Pepys, writing 2 years later, saying how fantastic, her court is, how it's much jollier and more fun than the court of Charles II, who was remembered as the merry monarch, let's not forget. And she's living the life of Riley. She's dressed up and she's having a great time, and she's also again being influential. She's restored her sort of chapel. She's taking an interest in evangelizing Catholicism. She's getting up to all sorts of things. She does go back to France. And I think, I think she intends to return to England. She leaves England during a time of plague. She does go back to France, but her health deteriorates, and she does end up she does die eventually in France.
Do we know what Henrietta's funeral was like and where she is buried?
Um, she was treated with great honor in France and had a fantastic funeral with one of the sort of greatest theologians at the time. Gave the sermon at her funeral, which looked back on her life and described what a remarkable human being she had been and some of the remarkable things she had done and the remarkable life she had led, with its many tragedies, because of course she had lost her husband in the most grotesque way. Don't forget her father was murdered too, so she was the daughter of a murdered king and the wife of, she would say, a murdered king. Um, so there was that tragedy, and she was buried with her ancestors, and their tombs were destroyed during the French Revolution in the 18th century.
Do you believe Henrietta left a legacy? If so, what legacy did she leave?
That what is a great pity, what has been a great pity, great disservice to all of us, really, how she's been talked down for all these centuries, because she is an example of resilience, which I think is something we could all do with, of courage. One of the things I really liked about Henrietta as well as the way that she had an incredible sense of humor, and even in the most sort of dire moments, she'll crack jokes. So when she arrives at one point, when she arrives in France in the middle of the Civil War, and she's been shot at, and she's very, very ill. She's had to leave her very tiny baby behind in England, and she looks absolutely terrible, and she makes a whole sort of joke of this about her sort of describing her arriving and how people are so horrified, and how she looks like something out of a fairy story. But that sort of legacy that she might have left of being actually a great queen and an example for many women of how to survive tragedy has rather been sort of erased. So I mean, there's the legacy, I suppose, of her building, of her palace in Greenwich, and there's pictures and so forth. I suppose the English, the theatre, she did introduce us women talking on stage, so having actresses, I suppose, as well as just actors performing on stage. I suppose those are all a part of what we're left with.
Before I let you go, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So, firstly, have you got
Right.
a history pet peeve?
I've got so many. Where to begin? Well, Catherine of Aragon is constantly described as if she was, Catherine of Aragon being described or always presented as this sort of dark-haired foreigner when she was very sort of fair. And there's an idea of sort of creating this idea of the sort of foreign princess. I always find that slightly irritating. I think the whole idea, the idea that Mary Tudor, Mary the First, was again just some sort of weak woman who just sort of was a useless queen, I always found incredibly irritating. The sort of there's the persistent myths, I suppose. I find irritating. Certainly, almost everything about the way the story of Henrietta Maria has been told, I find irritating. Again, this idea of her being a silly little girl is intensely annoying. And it's the way, as I said, it's the way that people tend to look at it. They forget that people at the time, they were looking back for examples, or what shaped them as what came before, whereas we tend to look at them what happened since. So, for example, Spain is always perceived as the great enemy in Tudor when we're looking at Tudor history. But if you're the Tudors, France was the traditional enemy, not Spain, France. It's little things like that.
If you could invite any historical figure to a dinner party, who would it be and why?
Well, I'd probably have some kind of biblical figure. I don't think I'd dare have Jesus Christ. I mean, I think that might be a bit too scary. Maybe one of the apostles. I think, how could one that 2000 year? That's what's Christianity has shaped Western civilization. So I think not to go back to that period, or have somebody from that period to meet would be insane. So I think I'd go for that.
Have you got a favourite historical building that you like to visit?
The Tower of London's a great visit. I rather enjoy that actually. It's such an extraordinary when you're in London, you're surrounded by these office buildings and skyscrapers, and then there's this extraordinary sort of medieval fortress, and full of fascinating things to see, and the ravens. I think I have to say I do. Oh, and I also do love a good monastic ruin, I must say.
If you could go back to any event or day in history, where would you go and why?
Well, I think it would have to be the crucifixion. I mean, it's again, I suppose we're coming up to Easter, aren't we? I mean, it would have to, or actually better, more cheerful, the resurrection. I think that'd be better actually. Easter Day, yes, the resurrection, please.
Have you got a favourite historical fact?
Gosh, a favorite historical fact. It's usually some sort of unexpected detail, isn't it? I mean, I enjoyed. I mean, just it's when you're reading history, as I do all the time. It's the little things. I remember reading this story of Elizabeth the First. You know, taking somebody's dog off them. I think it's Dr. Boleyn. She takes his dog, and it's little details like that actually about these great figures and their pets or their moments of bad behavior. Like I was saying about Henrietta Maria having this sort of tantrum in bed with Charles I. I like those kind of little details that bring small details in people's life, but that bring them totally to life. They're my favorite bits, actually, rather than the grand things.
Thank you so much for coming on today and telling us the real story of Henrietta Maria.
Thank you very much for listening, and I hope many of you will rediscover her.
Thank you for listening to her story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.